Welcome to the 80 Slasher Library. I'm your host, the 80 Slasher Librarian. Today's selection is the conclusion of A Nightmare on Elm Street, Dreamspawn, Chapter 23. Jane crouched over Brandon's lifeless, cooling body in the hot, stuffy confines of the school boiler room. The space was quickly filling with vile, stinking smoke, and Jane squinted at the fallen corpse of Rose, laying sprawled on her belly with her head thrust into the furnace. Flame licked at her ugly shirt, traveling busily down her body. Jane knew she needed to get the hell out of there, before the smoke overwhelmed her, but part of her wanted to stay, to die with Brandon. The only thought that penetrated her thick, syrupy shock was an image of her mother, receiving word of Jane's death from some faceless official. She could not put her mother through that. She stood, letting Brandon's head fall to the floor. His dead face was twisting away from her, slowly moving as if still in a dream. Jane turned away and headed for the stairs. When she pushed open the basement door, the bright sunlight nearly blinded her. The air in the stairwell was honey-thick with warm, drowsy afternoon light. Jane touched a hand to her cheek and felt the sting of 4 parallel cuts, still wet with blood. She mounted the stairs like a sleepwalker heading for the auditorium. If the carnage had been bad inside the dream world, it was 1,000 times more worse in the mundane light of day. Jane was unable to budge the main doors and wound up having to go around behind the stage. When she stepped out onto the center of the stage, the full horror of what had happened, what she had allowed to happen, hit her like a bucket of pig's blood, and she jammed the heel of her hand into her mouth, muffling an abortive scream. Hundreds of twisted bodies lay heaped by the double doors. People that Jane knew, teachers, students, people who had done no harm to anyone. She saw Mr. Fong, Madame Koenig, even that awful Mr. Fielding whose only crime was being boring. He had died trying to protect an older man, a science teacher whose name Jane didn't know. And there was Amber, newly sober and just starting to rebuild her life, only to have it taken away from her. She lay not smashed and bloody as she had been in the dream world, but serene and beautiful in the aisle, as if waiting for a director to yell cut. Worst of all, in the center of the auditorium, draped across the smashed and broken seats, was Lola. Jane ran to her friend, clutching Lola's stiffening hand. There were no visible injuries, nothing wrong with her that Jane could see. She was simply dead, cold, lifeless clay in the shape of a girl who had once been the best friend Jane ever had. There would be no career in Hollywood, no brilliant new make-believe monsters to menace the movie-going public. A real monster put an end to all her dreams, all her hopes and plans for the future. Everything was gone because of Rose's lies, and because of their willingness to believe those lies. Icy numbness engulfed Jane as she turned and walked back up onto the stage. Overhead there was a thunder of helicopters. Sirens tore through the impossible stillness that blanketed the scene. Jane made her way down the back steps and out into the hall. There were more dead students in the hallway, and worse yet, some still moving, eyes wide and blank and shell-shocked faces. She saw the big detective lying dead in the doorway of Ratner's office, and the fat kid from her homeroom rhythmically banging his head against the wall. Suddenly, the sprinklers went off in a cold, rusty gush, drenching Jane from head to toe, plastering her hair to her bleeding face, and soaking through her clothes. "Jane DeHaan?" A deep but muffled male voice called out. Jane slowly turned towards the voice. There was a man in a menacing black SWAT outfit, pointing a huge gun at her forehead. His face was hidden behind a complex gas mask, rendering him insectoid and inhuman. "Put your hands behind your head," he said. A group of several other identically clad men appeared behind him, all holding guns, all pointed at her. Jane had to force her arms to move, clasping them behind her head. She felt nothing, a vast arctic nothing like a gaping hole inside her. "Get down on the floor," the lead man gestured with his gun. "Now!" Jane stumbled awkwardly to her knees. The green tile floor seemed to tilt up slowly until it pressed against her cheek. It was cool and wet and felt almost good against her fevered skin as the water gushed down over her. Then there was someone on top of her doing something to her hands, but it didn't seem all that important. She was hauled roughly to her feet and marched down the hall and out the front steps, hands cuffed behind her. Outside the school, panic reigned. Parents crowded against yellow tape, faces pinched with the anxious terror. Paramedics carried the wounded on stretchers, those that screamed endlessly, and worse, those who didn't. She saw Lola's parents standing together by the steps. Her father had his arm around her mom. Her mom wore a clay-splattered t-shirt, her hand over her mouth. Media vultures swarmed excitedly through the chaos, shooting a tearful parent, a bloody hand swinging from beneath a sheet, smoke pouring from the school building, a pair of students clutching each other like plane crash survivors. When the cameras spotted Jane and her black-clad escort, they rushed at her like blood-frenzied sharks. "Jane DeHaan?" a blonde woman shouted. "Over here, Jane," an older man called. "Jane!" "Right here, Jane." "Jane!" "Jane!" "Why did you do it, Jane? Tell us about the Petticoat Mafia, Jane. Were you angry at your fellow students? Were you bullied? Tell us why you did it, Jane. Why? 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 Tell us why, Jane." Cameras all around her, arms and bodies pushing and shoving and shouting, and the black-clad man yanked hard on her cuffed wrists, grabbing her head and pushing it down, forcing her into the back of a police car. Outside the window, through the forest of bodies and cameras and fluffy microphones on poles, Jane spotted her mother. She was wearing that ugly blazer over her blue dress, and she was crying, pushing violently towards the car that held her daughter. Cameras surrounded her, and she struck out at them, calling Jane's name. Jane put her hand up against the window as the car began to nose its way through the teeming crowd. Ambitious cameramen ran after the car, and Jane's mother was lost in the press of bodies. Jane turned away from the window, her gaze trapped in the pattern of cracks on the seat in front of her. Better not to look, not to think. Better to follow the little maze of cracks and let everything else slide down under the heavy, mercury wash of cold, mindless nothingness. It was over. There was nothing left. Epilogue. It was late, but the television in the activity room still droned on, the weak speakers buzzing with the overtones of the anchorman's voice. The television slept during the day, its eyes closed to the room while the patients created pointless crafts, making magazine collages of their lives and things that they loved when they were on the outside. No one let the television open its eyes during the group therapy sessions either. While the Hispanic lady in the periwinkle polyester skirt and white cotton blazer encouraged the inmates to talk about their problems so that they could find their commonalities, the television slept. The television even slept while everyone ate in the little cafeteria, eating bland, suicide-proof finger food. At night, the nurses doled out medication to keep everyone peaceful and compliant, and herded everyone into the long dormitory. Those who were considered especially dangerous would be locked down in private cells. Each person would lie on a cot and wish that the television was awake instead of the nightlight. Everyone was afraid of the dark. Who knew what kinds of dreams the television dreamed behind the dark gray lid? It only awakened when the activity period started at precisely 7 p.m. But it continued to dream. Sometimes the inmates didn't notice because they were too medicated to be as awake as the television. Often they didn't realize the television was on at all. They dreamed with their eyes open and talked openly with their dream images to the exclusion of what or whoever was really there, sort of like the television. Tonight, as soon as dinner was over, medications were administered and therapies were concluded for the day. The television awoke. There was really only one person who cared that the television opened its dark gray lid to reveal its dreams. Some of the others pretended to care, but other things chattered in their heads and their vision blurred from the medication. Others were positioned as if they did care, catatonics with waxy arms and legs that could be pressed into any chair to look as if they were aware of the television. But the television was not fooled. The television knew who was watching, who needed its dreams, who felt the impact of the images it shared. It wasn't fooled. But the one person had been watching for days on end. This one person needed the television's dreams, because this person had no dreams of her own. Hopeless, friendless, sleepless, and lost, no dreams. She watched every single night. The television anticipated that she would be there on the functional, stain-proof vinyl couch in the activities room every night. And she was. The television imagined that it only showed its dreams to her, that it dreamed especially for her, its faithful lover. She watched with a strangely intense detachment, and the other patients were fearful of her and let her watch whatever she wanted to watch. She always watched the same thing. The television did not mind. It could have shown her much worse things, like tired sitcoms with grating laugh tracks, or the brainless reality shows, whatever that meant, or soap operas that had been on so long that Luke and Laura's grandchildren now ran spy operations with Robert Scorpio's grandchildren on mysterious islands in the Bermuda Triangle, or formulaic dramas about pretty teenagers in Los Angeles who hurt each other's feelings. The television had tastes. It just didn't have control over what it showed. Its unconscious ran much like that of the humans who watched, out of control. But not this human. Tonight the programming was like the last several nights. 60 Minutes, CNN, Fox, whoever had that latest report with the newest tidbit of information on this latest and most horrific high school massacre. They usually ran something like this. Outside of a high school in a leafy suburb, reporters of every stripe, sensational, respectable, fanatical, reputable, crowd around a pale young woman with long black hair, wet and silent. She wears all black clothing. It's not a good sign. They pick up on the black and immediately label her a freak. Troubled, she's not an anorexic ting, but a real girl with a real body, perhaps a few pounds overweight by popular standards. A fierce, stone-faced SWAT team leader, also dressed completely in black, though no one seems to comment on that fact, hovers over her as he tries to push her head down into a waiting car. It is almost as if he is afraid of her, the way he keeps her arms at length, as if her homicidal madness might be contagious. The reporters shout question after question. The young woman seems to be looking somewhere else, moving sluggishly like a sleepwalker. The man in black puts her into the car and wipes his hands on his bulletproof vest. A voiceover intones. 461 dead. The worst high school massacre in history. Petticoat Mafia. Could this have been prevented? Was there any warning? Tonight at 11. Emergency crews surround the high school police, fire department, sheriff. Yellow tape with black lettering wraps from tree to door handle to window latch. Every patch of asphalt and sidewalk is chalked and flagged for forensics. Fires burn out of control from damaged electrical wiring and broken gas mains, despite the shower of water from the emergency sprinklers. The carnage is obscured by the cracks in the glass of the front doors. From the outside, it looks as if an earthquake or some other natural disaster might have hit the school. But the blood streaking the skin and clothes of the black-haired young woman tells another story. There are 4 even slashes across her left cheek, like the claw marks of an angry lion, too perfect to be accidental. Then there are all the bodies of the students, so many bodies, piled up like victims of genocide in some faraway land. But these are American kids, suburban kids in Nike sneakers and Gap jeans. Our children. The voiceover reminds the viewers in solemn yet emotional tones, that last bit. The SWAT cop slams close the door as the young woman settles into the back seat behind the black grill. She sits back there staring, numb. The reporters surge toward the car, each with one hand pressed to the window, while the others grip microphones with bulbous, spongy heads. Nobody can get close to her. Their questions no longer seem to bother her. Nothing bothers her. The cop car pulls away and the reporters are denied any answers. Her lack of emotion in this footage will be analyzed endlessly by psychologists and pop authors, desperate for any sort of answer they can get. Not that there ever would be any kind of answers that they would understand. The news reports throughout the evening flash back to the school as the emergency crews and county coroner's office pull up and pull out one corpse after another from the school, carrying each one out in a body bag. Parents wail, families huddle. This is worse than Columbine, the experts comment. Far worse. The experts continued to comment night after night. A chic, well-dressed older woman addressed a psychologist who was more than a little geeky. The news show host. 1. So, what was different about the Hemingway High School massacre? Expert number 1. A number of things. For one, the children involved in this case were female. News show host number 1. But wait a minute. That's shocking, isn't it? We're all too familiar with young boys going on schoolyard killing sprees, as was the case at Columbine. But how often does something like this happen? Expert. But why is it shocking? Girls are just able to commit acts of violence as boys. The news show host. Able, but not as likely. Wouldn't you agree? True, but keep in mind these girls were very much like the boys who committed the Columbine killings. News show host. How so? Expert. They were bullied viciously from a young age. This bullying made them outcast. As a result of a kind of fury built up inside them, they became susceptible to negative influences. They wore black in imitation of their death rock idols, listened to angry music like Marilyn Manson, and were obsessed with violent horror movies. All the signs were there. The news show host. Oh, I see what you're getting at. But not all children respond to bullying with homicidal attacks. Am I right? Expert. That's not the point. These children were under extreme stress for a long period of time, and it finally exploded. They had insufficient coping skills to deal with these strong feelings. They needed self-esteem and the ability to stand up for themselves. But they had neither. So they looked for answers in rock songs and splatter films that teach them that killing is cool. News show host. But what about the school officials? Shouldn't they be more actively involved in policing these things? Was there anything they could have done? The expert. First of all, teachers and other school officials often watch incidents of bullying and do nothing about them. And they are rarely sought as a resource because life often gets tougher for children when they complain to an authority figure. They fear that the bullying will only get worse. Some children even prefer suicide to reporting bullying. News show host. That's not very encouraging. So, how do we combat this? How do we, as parents, protect our children and our schools from the sort of senseless violence that we've witnessed here at Hemingway? Experts. Talk to your children. Find out what's going on at school. Investigate bruises and other telltale marks that indicate your child might be suffering at school. Watch for a change in style of dress, especially all-black clothing, or a sudden interest in dark, violent films, video games, or music. If they become withdrawn or begin to show signs of violent fantasies, take them to a family therapist or a religious counselor. Then a slick, eye-catching montage of gory film clips and images of black-clad and sinister musicians stuttered through the television's dream, artfully spliced together with footage of the destruction of Hemingway High. On the next channel, a very serious man in a tasteful suit spoke to an older man who was clearly a high-brass cop. News show host number 2. But tell us, how exactly did 4 young girls commit so many murders so quickly? They had no guns, right? That is correct. News show host 2. So, what did they use if they had no guns? We've heard all sorts of explanations, from mass hysteria and drugs to poison and cutting weapons of some sort. Expert. Well, Tom, there's a lot of speculation, of course. Traditionally, girls are not as drawn to guns as boys are. News show host 2. But it's been said that girls are just as able to commit violence as boys. Why not use guns? The alleged perpetrators in this case were much smarter than that. They are believed to have used much more subtle, sophisticated means. Of slaughtering over 400 students, though? That is correct. Always the discussion came to the inevitable topic of how it happened. Why and who were easy enough, but how was another subject entirely. There were demolitions experts and hypnosis experts and mass hysteria experts. The one expert who had anything sensible to say was the one who said that some kind of narcotic had been infected almost every student, a sleeping agent. But how that contributed to such a sweep of violence, they could not say. Perhaps teachers and students alike were slumbering when the killers blitzed through with their weapons of mass destruction. But that did not explain the rather active poses some of the students had assumed in their deaths. news show host too. Now, there were reports of some sort of narcotic gases, but, yes, in this case, the alleged perpetrators were apparently able to utilize an extremely unusual weapon in their attack against the school. It is my understanding that a device was found. A military device. What sort of device? Sources have confirmed the device in question to be military in origin, but will not confirm the exact nature of said device. Where would teenage girls gain access to a top-secret military device? Apparently, one of the alleged perpetrators had a former foster father in the military. Just like in the cases with the young boys, these girls had access to a legal means of carrying out their aggression, and once again we see again the children obtaining the means for destruction from within their own homes. That is correct. But military or not, sleeping gas is a non-lethal substance. Am I right? Technically, yes, that is correct. What do you think the girls did with the other weapons that were clearly used in the attack? And do you think they meant to kill themselves? Oh, absolutely, to the second. As you'll recall, the Gibbons girl was found burned to death. Homicide was not a likely cause of death in this case, as they could find no evidence that anyone else had forced her into that furnace. Suicide is a far more feasible cause of death in that particular situation. Another channel, another expert. This one was a severe older woman with an unflattering bob haircut and dark lipstick, being grilled by a wet-eyed and oh-so-concerned blonde. Is it true that the members of this petticoat mafia had substance abuse problems and were sexually abused as children? That's right, Sheila. They were also quite sexually promiscuous, often with older men. This is frequently seen in victims of childhood sexual abuse. And tell us more about Jane DeHaan, the ringleader and sole survivor of the Petticoat Mafia. Jane was an honor roll student, highly intelligent, creative, and imaginative. As is frequently the case, the leader of this gang was far more intelligent than her underlings, so she was easily able to manipulate them into participating in the massacre. She was also a follower of the so-called goth movement and was obsessed with death. Her room was decorated with photographs of corpses, and she often wrote of her desire to kill on her internet journal. And I find this home video footage to be particularly telling. It cuts to the footage of the dark-haired girl, happy and laughing with her friends. She pulls a demonic monster mask over her head and waves a huge knife at the camera, chanting, "Kill! Kill! Kill!" This is unbelievable. I know for me personally, the blonde host paused and clutched her heart, turning teary-eyed towards the camera. As a parent of 2 young daughters, this case strikes very close to home. We need to be there for our children, communicate with them, and above all, watch for the signs. What kind of signs? Dressing in all black clothing, listening to certain types of music. Sometimes the television just wanted someone to blow the dust bunnies from its cord and wipe the grime from its top with a damp cloth and a splash of Pine Sol. It did not care about the endless, pointless discussions that went nowhere, like a labyrinth of dim hallways in a cheap hotel, like snake endlessly devouring itself and never feeling full. The girls they spoke about at such length were rendered down, reduced to a handful of unflattering photographs and some bad video clips that played over and over again. There was that one scene of a black-haired girl looking dazed and blank as she was placed in the cop car. There was the Monster Mask video, a favorite of those who favored a religious point of view. And there was the other media favorite, a snippet of footage showing the black-haired girl embracing her now-dead purple-haired friend. Again and again, the purple-haired girl turned to the camera and gave the lens, the audience, and the world the finger, while the experts carved her up into neat, safe, psychologically defined portions that could be spoon-fed to a public desperate to hear that she was totally unlike them in every way. The networks also showed reams of footage of the girls' parents, shoving reporters out of the doorways or huddling under black raincoats raised to cover their faces as they made their way to their cars. The experts, the parents of the dead, they all had plenty to say and tears to shed ad infinitum. The girls themselves were reduced to mute photos and mostly wordless video images, silently giving the world the finger. Curiously, the media did not speak to any of the stray survivors, who continued to scream long after someone slid a stainless steel needle into one of their faded blue veins, strapped them to a gurney, and wheeled them into an ambulance. No one could ever get a coherent word from them again, the news show host reported. After it was clear the survivors would never emerge from their respective sanitariums, the news show host stopped referring to them almost entirely. They were neither in critical condition nor permanently disabled, not physically anyway, and so they simply ceased to be newsworthy. It was as if the media didn't know what to do with them. As often happens with the mentally ill, they disappeared completely from the collective consciousness. Some of them were in a revolving door system of mental health care, jail, and homelessness, medicated, abused, and forgotten. Over the past 3 years, the population in front of the television had changed. A thick metal cage was installed around the television. Where once had sat mostly harmless lunatics, now were killers. People whose toxic madness had slopped over onto others, not just insane, but criminally insane. Mothers who cooked and ate their babies. Formerly mild-mannered office workers who snapped and poisoned the non-dairy creamer, taking out the entire typing pool. Doctors who started to believe they really were God. Religious leaders who suddenly decided members of their flock needed an early ticket to heaven. And one other, the television's faithful lover, the black-haired student with her glassy eyes and scarred cheek, sitting on the sofa with an unread Jane Austen novel in her lap. This murderess, this criminal mastermind, who had engineered the slaughter of over 400 of her fellow students. No one on the ward could come close to those kind of stats. She could watch anything she wanted. Sometimes the television wanted to close its eye to her, so that she would not see its dreams. She did not need to see those kind of dreams. They were obviously far too upsetting. But when the screen blurred and snowed, the nurse would slap the side of the television, so the television cleared up its dreams for everyone to see. The funerals were the worst, but everyone on the ward loved them most of all. A massive funeral followed the massacre, where they created an entire cemetery just for the children who died. It was like a mass grave, except that each body had a casket as it should. A dark wooden casket containing a young person who would never graduate from high school, never change, never grow old. The families went to multiple funerals of every denomination, supporting each other in sobbing clusters. The news show's host ran lists of students' names. All who died got their moment of fame then in that running list or face collage. These dreams were the dullest to the television, but the most moving to the television's most avid watcher. As she leaned forward and her eyes quivered at the scenes of hearse after hearse rolling into the cemetery lot, the media collages and the lists. But there was one funeral that the girl could not seem to bring herself to watch. In this particular video clip, a crowd of young people who supported an older woman at their center as her young and handsome son was lowered into the ground under a spray of calla lilies. The television felt bad that this particular footage was a favorite of the news media, shown over and over as perverse and spurious links were drawn between the dead boy and the killer girls. Eventually, the images of death were eclipsed by images of destruction as they tore down the abandoned school building. The wreckage of the building seemed almost more moving than the funerals. But the television did not see sadness. Rather, the girl who was watching seemed fascinated, surprised even. And when several of the families announced that they would move away, the beginning of a mass migration from that cursed suburb, her face dipped down and away from the television. She did not look up for some time. The television honestly did not understand why the nurses let her watch its dreams, these disturbing images that flashed from behind its dark gray lid. But that was not for it to understand, just to dream in its waking. Maybe the nurses were as cruel as the killer girls they spoke of, or maybe they were just unfeeling. As long as someone was not banging their head against the wall or pulling out their neighbor's hair, the nurses seemed unconcerned with whatever happened to the patients for whom they cared. Most of the patients seemed pacified by the dreams of the television. But now that the television had such different dreams, they often grew agitated. One of the patients stood before the faithful and declared that, as the Son of God and secret agent of Napoleon, she had been given the special responsibility of governing the viewing population of the activities room. She tucked the fingers of her right hand into the opening of her flannel shirt between the white plastic buttons and declared to the assembly of drillers and droners that he, Jesus of St. Helena, King of the Exiles, had accepted the responsibility and would adjudicate the night's viewing. He charged the television girl with a number of crimes: conspiracy to monopolize the television, conspiracy to emit poisonous rays of blue, conspiracy to eat paste and vomit in the president's secret shoebox of police tapes, conspiracy to keep the king incorrectly imprisoned in the female ward, conspiracy to marry Jimmy Carter, conspiracy to break open her teeth to allow the Catholics to escape, conspiracy to recruit aliens to the CIA, conspiracy to sing Johnny Cash songs backwards and talk to devils. It was a heavy list of accusations. The girl just stared at her accuser and said nothing. The other patients stirred when they heard the list of accusations. The king was not a multiple murderer, just a one-timer who had strangled her girlfriend and then set fire to her body in the parking lot of her parents' franchise smoothie bar. The inmates hollered, moaned, and laughed. One of them, an anorexic young woman who had stalked and tried to kill a well-known pop star, hopped in one place for several minutes, changing feet and swinging her arms until her neck and forehead were dripping with sweat. She then walked over to a fat, mentally disabled slug of a young woman and pushed her chair. The fat woman scowled and moved her lips in silence. She had not spoken a single word since she had killed her sexually abusive caregiver with a screwdriver. The stalker pushed the fat woman's chair again, and this time the woman swung a flabby arm at her. She ducked, making a raspy noise that eventually became a steady braying. "That's right," cried the King of the Exiles. "That's right. We have amongst us the living, breathing carbon copy of the Antichrist." She rolled the R in Antichrist, and her eyes flared dramatically. Clambering onto the battered coffee table, she kicked the magazines off the surface, the pages fluttering to the floor in a confused heap of celebrities in makeup. The hooting, growling, grimacing, and braying rumbled through the activities room. Some faces glowed with anticipation of a frenzy. There hadn't been a good frenzy since Rita, the killer nanny, Carr, tore off her shirt and beat her head against the wall so hard that blood mingled with the gray juices of her cerebrum as they smeared on the mark-resistant paint. Rita had earned the nickname the killer nanny in the tabloids after she had suffocated 4 of her small charges while their parents were in Europe. When everyone saw Rita dragged away shirtless and twitching, they all stripped off their clothes and ran madly, how else would they run, around the activities room and into the halls. It was a really good frenzy. There had been some talk of upping the security and even instituting 24-hour lockdown, but the endless discussion within the bureaucracy went nowhere and things stayed as they were. The other faces in the room dimmed with concern. They did not want a frenzy. A frenzy meant that someone would come and turn off the television and make them go to bed. Many people would be restrained, and the staff often did not differentiate between who was agitated and who was not. The nurses only cared if things were quiet and on schedule. The nurses often raggled their keychains tauntingly at the patients. The keys were freedom. The keys let the inmates outside to the exercise area where they were allowed their once weekly mandated 30 minutes of aimless wandering, supervised by armed guards in towers atop each of the 4 corners. But far more importantly, those keys also let the nurses themselves pass through the big doors and into the outside. Not the bland captive outside or the exercise area, but the vast and unlimited outside of the real world, where there were glossy red cars and dogs with healthy teeth and bones and delicious hamburgers for only $1.99. There was frosty cold beer and deodorant soap that smelled like a fresh Irish waterfall instead of like coal tar and industrial disinfectant. There were things they saw on the television that they wanted. If they could not have them, they could watch the dreams of the television and remember what they were like. That is, if they ever knew to start with. Some of them never had families, cars, careers, homes. These unfortunates had known nothing but the walls of institutions, and then had lashed out against their fellow inmates and wound up here, in yet another institution. But others had once had that kind of thing and more until one day they just got lost in their thoughts. They began to explore alternate realities and began to behave strangely. They knew not what they were doing, but they could not help themselves. Eventually, it seemed quite logical to pick up a knife or a gun. In a single murderous outburst, they lost everything, no longer able to resist the voices egging them on from the rotten cores of their mad, howling brains. One way or another, they would never have more than the grass on the grounds and the sky. That small patch of sky, imprisoned between four walls just like they were. The rest came from the television. The king of the exiles held both hands high, beseeching some maker above her. "Holy, holy, holy!" she cried, the images of the television flashing behind her head in a media halo of car commercials and station identifications. "Holy God Almighty, give us the television!" She swung both arms back, palms up, to beseech the television. The television noisily dreamed on, unheeded. And then the frenzy began. The anorexic woman brayed, and someone else chittered like a squirrel. "Holy, holy, holy!" the king of the exiles crooned, dancing to the dull dag-a-buzz buzz of the soft drink commercial. The coffee table was now clear of any magazines. Her slippers slapped the tabletop as she mimicked the rickety tat-tat-tat of Sammy Davis Jr., and she whistled something that was entirely unlike a real melody at all. The fat woman waved her arms as other patients swooped down on her, some trying to kiss her head and others biting her ears that peeked out from her bowl cut. The ammonia fumes of piss wafted far from the far side of the activities room. The television girl hid her head in her hands. Not everyone got excited. Several of the citizens could barely move from under the heavy tarp of chlormazepine. The din of the others did not faze them, much less inspire them to commit petty crimes of distraction and noise. Eventually, the king of the exiles leapt from the table to the ground, grabbed one of the catatonics, and started swinging her around, her arms locked like a Barbie doll. When she left off from the senseless quadrille, her catatonic partner stood where she had started, bent forward slightly, tufts of baby-fine blonde hair askew. She convorted cheerfully to the next lady, a younger woman holding a teddy bear. She wasn't a child. She was fully grown with a slender waist that formed a perfect bridge between her small tits and legs that could have held up skyscrapers. When the king grabbed her, the girl gasped and cried, shaking her head. "No, no, 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 no!" The king threw both arms around the girl's waist and squeezed her like a tube of toothpaste, shaking her so that her breast bounced against the king's sunken and concave chest, where she had cut off her own breast with a Swiss Army knife. I don't like to dance. Let me down." One of the more excitable patients jumped up like an orangutan on the table and flung the volume knob on the television, which meant it began to dream very, very loudly. The television girl covered her ears. This got the attention of the orderlies, who poured into the activities room like Keystone cops with syringes. A couple of nurses slammed the door closed and hit the button that locked down the entire ward. The orderlies first grabbed the king of the exiles as she hollered and jabbed her with the needle. She kicked and shouted, "Holy, holy, holy!" When they finally wrapped restraints around her ankles and wrists, she declared that she loved Josephine more than "that traitor," and her breathing slowed. The others were easy enough to capture and restrain. However, as the television had seen before, they restrained several patients who were not agitated, using chemical restraints, shocks. But they did not restrain the television girl. She sat immobile and alone on the vinyl couch, watching the dreams of the television as they emptied the room around her. The room was now almost quiet, and the television dreamed of a familiar face, the girl with the black hair. A news show host announced that she would not be able to stand trial, cutting to a juicy shot of her sorrowing mother. Her attorneys and the judge had declared her unfit. A nurse, the tallest one with thick arms and acne, stepped between the girl and the television. She looked different than normal. The nurse crossed her arms and wagged her stubby finger at the girl. "Jane," she said, "you have to sleep sometime, you know." She flicked off the television. It had no idea what happened next. 9, 10, never sleep again. The end. Okay, this has been the conclusion of A Nightmare on Elm Street Dreamspawn. And I gotta say, up until like page 200, I mean, I really liked the characters, but I was like, man, I wish they'd hurry up and bring Freddy into this book. But once they did, I think the book played out quite good. I think the writing was good. There might have been a little too much character development and a few pages that were just filler pages, but all in all, I would say this book was really good. I enjoyed the story. Not quite sure how I feel about the epilogue and the way that they knew Jane's name and that she had done all that before they even got to investigate it. So I'm not sure what to think of that. But I'll sit with it for a while, and I'll return to my opinion on it later. Guys, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe. Click that like button. Drop me a comment. Love to hear from you guys. I'll be back tomorrow where I will be doing my first Halloween novel here on the 80 Slasher Librarian YouTube channel. Thanks for listening, and pleasant dreams!